Eddie Rickenbacker was an American icon and a complex figure who became one of the most celebrated heroes of the 20th century. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker, fighter ace, race car driver, and aviation pioneer, was born in Columbus, Ohio on October 8, 1890. He came from a humble immigrant family. He had a distinctive personality marked by fierce determination and an unbreakable will to survive. Rickenbacker's early years were marked by hardship and struggle. His father, Wilhelm Rickenbacker, was a Swiss immigrant who worked as a construction laborer. The family was poor, living in a crowded neighborhood among other immigrant families trying to make their way in America. Young Eddie, as he was called, learned early that life demanded toughness and resilience. When Eddie was 13 years old, tragedy struck the Rickenbacker family. His father was killed in a construction accident, leaving the family without its primary breadwinner. Eddie, the third of 8 children, was forced to leave school and find work to help support his mother and siblings. This premature end to his formal education would shape his entire life. He never completed the 7th grade, yet he would go on to achieve things that educated men could only dream of. The lack of formal education gave him an inferiority complex that drove him to prove himself again and again throughout his life. Rickenbacker took whatever work he could find. He worked in a glass factory, a brewery, a shoe factory, and a foundry. The jobs were hard and dangerous, but they taught him the value of labor and the importance of mechanical skill. He was naturally drawn to machines and showed an aptitude for understanding how things worked. This mechanical intuition would serve him throughout his career. In his early teens, Rickenbacker became fascinated with the new automobile industry. Cars were still rare and exotic machines in the early 1900s, but Eddie saw them as the future. He took a job with a local automobile company, starting as a laborer but quickly moving into mechanical work. He had found his calling. By the time he was in his late teens, Rickenbacker had become an accomplished automotive mechanic and engineer. He worked for several automobile companies, learning everything he could about engines, transmissions, and the emerging technology of the horseless carriage. His lack of formal education was no hindrance. He learned by doing, by taking things apart and putting them back together, by trial and error. In 1910, Rickenbacker made the leap from mechanic to race car driver. He had been working as a riding mechanic, the person who accompanied drivers in races to handle repairs and adjustments during competition. But he wanted to drive himself. He began competing in local races and quickly showed natural talent. Racing in the early 20th century was incredibly dangerous. Cars were primitive, tracks were rough, and safety equipment was virtually non-existent. Drivers were killed regularly, but Rickenbacker seemed to thrive on the danger. By 1912, Rickenbacker had become one of America's top race car drivers. He competed in major races across the country, earning substantial prize money and national recognition. He was known for his aggressive driving style and his mechanical knowledge. While other drivers relied on their mechanics, Rickenbacker could diagnose and fix problems himself, often making adjustments during races that gave him competitive advantages. He competed in the Indianapolis 500 multiple times, though he never won the prestigious race. His racing career made him wealthy by the standards of the time and gave him a taste for adventure and competition that would define his entire life. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Rickenbacker followed the news with great interest. America remained neutral for the first 3 years of the conflict, but when the United States entered the war in April 1917, Rickenbacker was determined to serve. He was 26 years old, older than most volunteers, and his racing fame could have exempted him from service. But Rickenbacker wanted to fight. He initially hoped to form a squadron of race car drivers who would serve as military drivers, but the army had other ideas. Rickenbacker was sent to France as a staff driver, chauffeuring officers around. It was respectable work but not the combat role he craved. While serving as a driver, Rickenbacker became fascinated with military aviation. He watched American pilots training and saw in flying the same excitement and danger that had attracted him to auto racing. He began campaigning for a transfer to the air service. His superiors were skeptical. At 27, he was considered too old to become a pilot. He also lacked the college education that was preferred for officer candidates. But Rickenbacker was persistent. He used his connections and his mechanical expertise to make his case. He argued that his racing experience gave him the reflexes and judgment needed for aerial combat. Finally, he was accepted for flight training. Rickenbacker proved to be a natural pilot. He soloed after only 25 days of instruction and quickly mastered the art of flying. He was assigned to the 94th Aero Squadron, one of the first American fighter squadrons to see combat. The squadron's insignia was a hat in a ring, symbolizing America's entry into the fight. Rickenbacker arrived at the front in March 1918 and flew his first combat patrol in April. He was older than most of the other pilots, many of whom were fresh out of college. They called him Pop because of his age. But Rickenbacker's maturity and experience would prove to be assets in the deadly business of aerial combat. Aerial combat in World War I was unlike anything that had come before. Pilots flew fragile biplanes made of wood and fabric, armed with machine guns that fired through the propeller arc. Dogfights took place at altitudes where the air was thin and cold. Pilots wore leather jackets and goggles but had no parachutes. If your plane caught fire or broke apart, you went down with it. The life expectancy of a combat pilot was measured in weeks. It was a young man's game, and it demanded courage, skill, and a certain willingness to embrace death. Rickenbacker's first weeks of combat were frustrating. He flew patrol after patrol without encountering enemy aircraft. When he finally did engage German planes, his guns jammed and he was forced to break off the fight. He began to study aerial tactics obsessively, learning from more experienced pilots and developing his own theories about combat flying. Unlike many pilots who relied on instinct and aggression, Rickenbacker approached aerial combat as a science. He studied the capabilities of different aircraft, learned to judge distances and angles, and developed tactics based on careful calculation rather than reckless bravery. His first confirmed victory came on April 29, 1918, when he shot down an enemy observation plane. The kill was witnessed by ground troops, making it official. Rickenbacker felt no elation, only a grim satisfaction that he had done his job. He would later write that he took no pleasure in killing, but he understood that aerial combat was kill or be killed. Over the following months, Rickenbacker's score mounted steadily. He shot down 2 planes in May, 3 in June, and began to establish himself as one of the squadron's leading aces. An ace was a pilot who had shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft, and achieving ace status was the ambition of every fighter pilot. In September 1918, Rickenbacker was promoted to captain and given command of the 94th Aero Squadron. He was now responsible not just for his own survival but for leading other pilots into combat. He proved to be an effective commander, combining tactical skill with genuine concern for his men. He led by example, flying more missions than required and always taking the most dangerous assignments himself. Under his leadership, the 94th became one of the most successful American squadrons of the war. Rickenbacker's own victory total continued to climb. He shot down 5 planes in September alone, bringing his total to 15 confirmed kills. He was becoming famous back home, with newspapers following his exploits and celebrating him as America's ace of aces. The final months of the war saw Rickenbacker at the peak of his abilities. He flew multiple missions daily during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the final major American campaign of the war. On September 25, he shot down 2 German planes in a single mission. On October 10, he shot down 3 planes in one day, an extraordinary feat by the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Rickenbacker had been officially credited with 26 aerial victories, 22 aircraft and 4 observation balloons. This made him America's leading ace of World War I, a title he would hold forever. Rickenbacker's combat record was remarkable not just for the number of victories but for his survival. He had flown over 300 combat hours and returned from every mission. Many of the pilots he had trained with were dead. The fact that he survived when so many others died was testament to his skill, his caution, and perhaps his luck. He had been shot down once, forced to land behind enemy lines but managing to make it back to friendly territory. He had been wounded slightly by ground fire. But he had survived. For his service, Rickenbacker received the Medal of Honor, 8 Distinguished Service Crosses, and the French Croix de Guerre. He returned home as America's greatest war hero. The transition from war to peace was difficult for Rickenbacker as it was for many veterans. He was 28 years old, famous, and uncertain about his future. He briefly returned to auto racing but found it less satisfying than it had been before the war. He had seen too much death to find the same thrill in racing that he once had. He tried his hand at various business ventures, including automobile sales and manufacturing. Some succeeded, others failed. He was searching for something that could match the intensity and purpose he had found in combat. In 1922, Rickenbacker became involved with the Rickenbacker Motor Company, which produced luxury automobiles. The company used his name and fame to market its cars, and Rickenbacker served as vice president and director of sales. For a few years, the company prospered, but the automobile industry was becoming increasingly competitive. By 1927, the Rickenbacker Motor Company was in financial trouble. It was eventually absorbed by another manufacturer, and Rickenbacker lost much of his investment. It was a painful reminder that business success required different skills than combat flying or auto racing. In 1927, Rickenbacker married Adelaide Frost Durant, a woman from a wealthy Detroit family. The marriage was happy and enduring, lasting until his death. Adelaide provided stability and support as Rickenbacker continued to search for his place in the peacetime world. They had 2 sons, David and William. Rickenbacker was a demanding father, expecting his sons to show the same toughness and determination that had defined his own life. In 1929, Rickenbacker purchased the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, fulfilling a long-held dream. He owned and operated the famous racetrack for 16 years, hosting the Indianapolis 500 and other major racing events. It was a successful venture that kept him connected to the automotive world he loved. But Rickenbacker's most important post-war career was in aviation. In 1935, he became general manager of Eastern Airlines, a struggling airline that was on the verge of bankruptcy. Rickenbacker saw aviation as the future of transportation, just as he had once seen automobiles as the future. He threw himself into the airline business with the same intensity he had brought to racing and combat flying. He was a demanding boss, known for his temper and his insistence on efficiency and safety. Under his leadership, Eastern Airlines was transformed from a failing company into one of America's major airlines. Rickenbacker's management style was shaped by his military experience and his working-class background. He believed in hard work, discipline, and personal accountability. He had little patience for excuses or inefficiency. He would personally inspect aircraft and facilities, often showing up unannounced to check on operations. He insisted on rigorous maintenance standards and pilot training. His focus on safety was ahead of its time and helped establish Eastern as one of the industry's safest airlines. He also understood the importance of customer service and worked to make air travel more comfortable and accessible to average Americans. In February 1941, Rickenbacker survived one of the most dramatic incidents of his life. He was a passenger on an Eastern Airlines flight that crashed in Atlanta, Georgia. The crash killed 7 people and left Rickenbacker near death. He suffered a fractured skull, crushed pelvis, broken ribs, and numerous other injuries. Doctors did not expect him to survive. He spent months in the hospital, enduring multiple surgeries and excruciating pain. But Rickenbacker's will to live was as strong as ever. He refused to die. Through sheer determination and his legendary toughness, he recovered. The crash left him with permanent injuries and chronic pain, but within a year he was back at work, running Eastern Airlines. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Rickenbacker was 51 years old, too old for combat but eager to serve his country again. He became a special consultant to the War Department, traveling around the world to inspect facilities, boost morale, and report on conditions. In October 1942, Rickenbacker was sent on a mission to the Pacific Theater. He was flying in a B-17 bomber that was supposed to deliver him to a meeting with General Douglas MacArthur. The plane became lost over the Pacific Ocean and ran out of fuel. The crew was forced to ditch in the ocean, hundreds of miles from land. Rickenbacker and 7 other men found themselves adrift in 3 small life rafts with minimal supplies. They had no food and only 4 oranges and a few chocolate bars to sustain them. They had no water except what they could collect from occasional rain squalls. They were exposed to the tropical sun by day and cold winds at night. Sharks circled their rafts constantly. The men began to weaken from hunger, thirst, and exposure. 1 man died after 8 days. The others were slowly dying. They drifted for 24 days, covering hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Rickenbacker took charge of the group, rationing the meager supplies and maintaining discipline and hope. He led prayers and kept the men focused on survival. When a seagull landed on his head one day, he caught it with his bare hands. The bird was killed and eaten raw, providing crucial protein. They used parts of the bird as bait to catch fish, which provided more food. Rickenbacker's leadership and determination kept the group alive. Finally, on the 24th day, they were spotted by a Navy patrol plane. The survivors were rescued and taken to a hospital. Rickenbacker had lost 50 pounds and was severely weakened, but once again he had survived when death seemed certain. The story of Rickenbacker's ordeal at sea became international news. His survival against impossible odds added to his legend. He wrote a book about the experience called 7 Came Through, which became a bestseller. The incident reinforced his reputation as a man who simply could not be killed, someone who possessed an almost supernatural ability to survive. After recovering from his Pacific ordeal, Rickenbacker continued his wartime service, visiting troops and inspecting facilities around the world. He was outspoken in his views, sometimes criticizing military policies he disagreed with, which occasionally got him in trouble with authorities. After World War II, Rickenbacker returned to Eastern Airlines and continued to build the company. The post-war years saw explosive growth in commercial aviation, and Eastern was well positioned to take advantage. The airline expanded its routes, upgraded its fleet, and became one of the largest carriers in the United States. Rickenbacker remained as president and later chairman until 1963, when he finally retired at age 73. Under his leadership, Eastern had grown from a small regional carrier to a major airline with routes throughout the Americas. Rickenbacker's later years were marked by increasing conservatism and outspoken political views. He was a fierce anti-communist and a critic of big government. He believed in individual initiative and free enterprise, values shaped by his own rise from poverty to success. He was critical of labor unions, social welfare programs, and what he saw as the softening of American character. These views made him controversial, and he engaged in public disputes with politicians and journalists. He remained physically active despite his injuries, swimming daily and maintaining a rigorous schedule. Throughout his retirement, Rickenbacker remained a public figure. He gave speeches, wrote articles, and continued to advocate for aviation and national defense. He served on corporate boards and remained involved in veterans organizations. He was a living link to the heroic age of early aviation and the First World War. Young people who met him were awed by his presence and his stories of a vanished era. He had known the Wright brothers, Charles Lindbergh, and every major figure in aviation history. He had survived more close calls with death than seemed possible for one man. On July 23, 1973, Eddie Rickenbacker died at his home in Zurich, Switzerland, where he had been receiving medical treatment. He was 82 years old. The cause of death was complications from pneumonia and stroke. His body was returned to the United States for burial. His funeral was attended by thousands, including military officers, aviation pioneers, and former employees. He was buried in Greenlawn Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio, not far from where he had been born into poverty more than 8 decades earlier. Rickenbacker's legacy is that of an authentic American hero. He rose from poverty and limited education to become the nation's greatest fighter ace. He survived combat, crashes, and 24 days adrift in the Pacific. He built a major airline and became a successful businessman. He represented an older American ideal of rugged individualism, courage, and determination. His life story seemed almost too dramatic to be true, yet every part of it was documented and verified. Modern historians recognize Rickenbacker as one of the most remarkable Americans of the 20th century. His combat record has never been surpassed by an American pilot. His survival skills became legendary. His business achievements were substantial. He lived through both World Wars, the Great Depression, and the social upheavals of the 1960s, maintaining his principles throughout. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Eddie Rickenbacker comes from his own words. He once said that courage is doing what you're afraid to do, that there can be no courage unless you're scared. He faced fear constantly throughout his life and never let it stop him. This courage, combined with mechanical skill, quick thinking, and an unbreakable will to survive, defined his character. Rickenbacker represents a particular type of American hero, the self-made man who succeeds through determination and ability rather than privilege or education. His story inspired generations of Americans who saw in him proof that anyone could achieve greatness regardless of their starting point in life. In the end, Eddie Rickenbacker was neither a perfect man nor a saint, but rather an extraordinary individual who lived an extraordinary life. His legacy includes his combat victories, his survival against impossible odds, and his contributions to commercial aviation. He is remembered today as America's ace of aces and as a symbol of American courage and determination. His life spanned an era of incredible change, from horse-drawn carriages to jet aircraft, from the Wright brothers to the space age. He participated in that transformation and helped shape it. Rickenbacker was in death as in life a man of action and achievement, remembered for his courage, his survival, and his unwavering belief in American values.